Emulation, a non-controversial topic. Today on...
Press B to insert coin.
That Y2K is cut up.
Put that in your slot.
Oh.
Little meme
Now we got a little too
humor.
controversial.
No, that has to be a new T-shirt now.
Emulation and merchandise. Today on... Welcome, everybody, to Press B to Cancel. I'm this week's host, SicJake. But never alone. No, of course not. And not emulated, but here in person, we have Pulse 109. How you doing, Pulse?
I am doing well. How are you?
Fantastic. And also we've got Werewolf. How you doing?
I'm not entirely sure how I got here, but I think I'm all right.
Definitely not downloading, because that'd be wrong. And not to be underscored, GP of the Retro Therapy. How you doing?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
No, that's not how this works.
Okay.
Okay, so this week, I want to get right into it, because I love this topic. I eat and breathe this stuff. And it's kind of the whole thing we do in the podcast. And that is playing retro games, emulation, or original hardware. I don't want to say controversial, but just something, when you say the word emulation, can trigger people. And it's just ridiculous.
I am triggered.
You're triggered. I mean, we all
I
get
am
triggered. Just have somebody say Final Fantasy VIII, and I can't stop.
What?
I can't shut up.
Don't say those words.
Yeah, it's not a good game. It's just trash.
There's going to be a whole slew of people who are accidentally triggered with Final Fantasy 18. We're getting close.
No, because it'll be XVIII. And the X
No,
will
like
throw it off.
just speaking the words.
Oh, yeah.
I see. All right. Anyway, so emulation, I guess, the thing. And it does trigger some people. I know from my personal experience, I recently bought something called a Mister. It's a FPGA system, and we'll talk a little bit about it later on. But it goes without failing. The few times I've streamed recently with it, or if I mention it in anybody's chat, the immediate response is, well, it's not original hardware. It's not the same thing. I'm like, I know it's not the same thing. I don't care. It's still a pretty awesome system. And at the end of the day, the important thing is it's something I can use to play retro games that I like. And it's not to say emulation is bad. Not at all. I think everybody here in the podcast is emulating something to this day or has recently. So I'm going to go quickly around the room, just check with the guys. How do you play your retro games today? GP, how about you start? How do you play your retro?
I'm a bit of a collector of the carts, and whenever possible, I prefer to play on original hardware. So I feel like maybe I was the wrong person to ask. I'm so sorry. Am I supposed to say emulate?
Oh, so you're one of those assholes.
But what about, you've got a Retron too, don't you?
Had a Retron. It actually belonged to my cousin, so he has that. He let me borrow it for a time. But that was mostly just for like marathons where I was trying to beat like big numbers of games in under a certain number of hours, so I didn't have to mess with a lot of extra stuff. I could just go in between like the NES or the Sega and the Super Nintendo without having to unhook and rehook up systems.
Damn you being efficient. Smart.
Okay, see, I asked earlier before the podcast if you had a Retron because I was going to talk about it.
Well, to be honest, like I've played on a Retron, but I don't really use one.
Okay.
Because I care about the sanctity of games. And if you emulate, you can just eat my entire ass.
Oh.
I'm kidding. Emulating is fine. I am currently doing a Final Fantasy marathon of 1 through 7, and I have yet to play any of them on hardware. So,
Well, yeah, so we should talk more about that too, because I've been watching here and there you playing Final Fantasy. And one of the things about emulation is, with a lot of emulators, especially today, there's been a couple new innovations, right? Save states, everybody knows about. But the one I'm talking about is fast forwarding. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, I hate it when a game does not respect the player's time. And I'm not just being a jerk.
Bullshit.
Not this time. But it's annoying for RPGs. Like, I love Final Fantasy games, but I just don't want to sit and spend 50 hours playing through them anymore. And GP, watching you stream, you are using the fast forward everywhere.
Menu navigation.
Well, that's mostly it's for the menu.
Item management.
Yes, because, well, it depends on the game also. For example, Final Fantasy II sucked. There's not much I can do about that. No, and of course that game is even more grind heavy than most of the other Final Fantasies. Yeah, so I don't know. At this point, after fast forwarding through a lot of the grinding of 2, it became second nature. And really what I should do is go and deprogram the controller so it doesn't have the fast forward function. But yeah, like I've just found that I've gotten used to fast forwarding through, certain parts. Not the entire thing, certainly. The music alone, it would be a travesty to fast forward through all of it. So battles, I try not to fast forward because the music's, great. The overworld I don't do. But if I'm accessing the menu, most of the time, I'll go a little faster. Just because.
You can.
Yeah. I can, but I probably shouldn't.
Right, but you're not the only one doing it. I do the same damn
That doesn't
thing.
make it right. Yeah. But and to be honest, before the fast forward existed, I never really had those complaints. So it's just been something brought to my attention because I've done it once. It's required now. But I think if I were to pull up, the original Final Fantasy II on Super Nintendo and play that, hardware without the fast forward, I think I'd still be okay. I think part of the reason I'm doing it is just because it can be a bit obnoxious otherwise.
Yeah, and it's also the grinding is difficult. I always worry about playing RPGs on stream, and is it too grindy, right, for the stream, or should I do some of the stuff offline? Right. Where the fast forward lets you kind of power through a lot of that. Yeah. So I like the fast forward as well. In fact, when I was recording some stuff for our YouTube, press speed to cancel on YouTube. Please go subscribe. Thank you.
Like, comment, subscribe.
So when I was doing stuff for that, I was playing some Final Fantasy games, and I was playing Final Fantasy VI, and I used it in the same damn thing. I was fast forwarding for the start of it, and I had to stop myself to remind myself I was recording, and I didn't want to fast forward on the recording. But it's incredibly convenient for getting through some of those battles.
Yes, I agree. I don't think I would ever do that on cutscenes. And I don't see myself doing it like with Final Fantasy V because that'll be a first playthrough for me. So I don't want to fast forward through anything that I'm going to be like potentially missing. And then of course with 6 and 7, I feel like it would be disrespectful to fast forward through any frames of those. So I think it's coming to an end for me.
I know. I mean, I've did it through 7. There's a lot of that game I don't like. But that's okay. Okay, so original hardware. You like collecting cards. That's really good. And also emulators for Final Fantasy. Wolf, what about yourself? How do you play your retro right now?
It's either way, honestly. It kind of depends on the platform and what I have available for the platform. So let's take the NES. I have an NES Classic, so I'm okay using that. Dumping a bunch of games on there. It's just easier to do that than dig through the carts, have to clean them from time to time. There's definitely a quality of life there, especially now that I've introduced my son to it. Like, he gets to experience all these old games without having to shuffle the cartridges and deal with the flashing pig screen in case the cartridge isn't working right and all that.
But that's part of the process. That's why we grew up, dude. That's why you don't the emulation. Sorry, I blacked out.
But there's also, I mean, we look back on that stuff fondly, but it was a pain in the ass. I mean, look at how many hours of our lives we lost trying to get a cartridge to work in a Nintendo or a Super Nintendo, really. I mean...
Yeah, there's been at least 2 for me, and then I'd switch carts.
It's frustrating. So, like, I'm glad he doesn't have to deal with that. Despite missing that experience, it's probably for the best.
It builds character. For example, did you guys ever act like you were doctors when you were blowing into the cartridges and like you're trying to resuscitate somebody from like Grey's Anatomy, but you're 6 years old with a cart, plugging it in, trying to find that sweet spot, hitting the power button, and just looking up and saying, "Not today, Lord."
No, I'd clean the cart out with like a Q-tip, and then I'd be pretending that I'm just like some hacksaw before I knew what a hacksaw was.
I do suspect we were less prone to switching games because there was so much effort in getting the game to work in the first place.
Yep.
So, like, once the game was in, like, that's the game you were playing unless it just absolutely broke you.
I know. I always had my games affixed to a Game Genie permanently, so the seal was just immaculate. I never had to blow my cartridges.
I mean, it really comes down to the controller, and in some cases, the controller is not that great. But I mean, let's consider using a SNES controller on your PC for a Genesis game. It never feels right. Something about it just doesn't work with my brain, so I can't do it. So I would rather play on the Genesis than with emulation with a controller that's not for the Genesis. So it really goes back and forth. And then there's the issue of some platforms don't emulate well, like the Saturn.
Right. I was going to ask about the Saturn especially.
I love my Saturn. I would love to emulate the games because it would be a lot easier for me to deal with. Instead of, I have 2 Saturns, both of them have their issues. And, there's the ever-present issue of, great, my save battery is dead. So it's not just, the other issues of, do I want funky audio or funky visuals? Is the disc spinner going to work today? It's also a matter of, I'm not going to be able to save very well. The other side of that coin is, though, like, that's what I'm stuck with because nothing emulates the Saturn very well. The best you're going to get is glitchy and probably rather visually messed up. I know there's a couple of games out there that work beautifully, but for the most part, there's always an issue with a Saturn game when it's emulated. I mean, it's not even easy enough to just throw the disc in the computer and emulate it that way. Even then, it's got issues and chokes on things, and I don't understand why that's the case.
Well, see, the other issue with Saturn is because of something I learned the hard way from cleaning my basement recently is disc rot, right? CD-ROMs don't last forever. They have a shelf life for like 15 years, I think, at max.
What?
You take care of them. I know. I lost Neverwinter Nights and a bunch of my PC games this way. And I had them in the box, in the jewel cases, but I guess stored in a basement for a few years, did them in. So I look at, like, you have the Saturn, how are your games holding up? And, like, what happens when those discs go, right?
As of right now, all my Saturn games are doing fine. The only game I've had an issue with like that was Sonic CD. That's it for the Sega CD. That's the only bad disc I've had, fortunately.
That's pretty good.
My bad disc was, I think it was Spice Girls, Spice World. But that wasn't a game. That was just a CD.
The music CD? Well,
Music
still.
CD.
I feel for your loss.
But yeah, like there's definitely
A moment of silence, please, for Spice Girls.
Was it
Sarah, if you listen to this, I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to stick around and keep talking about Spice Girls right now.
It's what you want. It's what you really want.
was it Spice World?
Yeah, Spice World.
Oh,
Yeah.
that disc was fire. Why did they never put out a double disc?
I mean, they didn't need to. It was just so good. It was just the perfect... Oh, sorry. Okay, I didn't mean to...
No. Saturn, please.
If I could emulate a Saturn, I would absolutely love to. But at this point, I'm stuck using the discs, and I'm looking into alternatives to where I can modify my Saturn to use an SD card, and that's still hundreds of dollars.
Well, actually, so it's good you mentioned that because there is something that just came out not too long ago, and it's called the Terra Onion, I believe it is. And what it is, it's a console mod for Dreamcast and Saturn. I think there's one for the Sega CD. And it's much like how people use EverDrives, which are basically like flash carts to put in their original hardware to play games. Terra Onion lets you play ROMs, basically replacing the CD drive in those systems. And it's great because it's using a FPGA chip to recreate the disk drive as accurately as you're going to get. So 10, 15 years from now, when, the last of Saturn games are probably going to disappear, at least you'll still be able to use your original console for the most part, just replace the CD drive with this add-on.
Yeah, but I was looking into that earlier this year, and I mean, I don't know if that's still an issue, but at the time it was sold out, and I think new, it was still like a $200 kit.
Let me just check here. Wow, it is expensive. 182 euros.
Yeah, so it was about a $200 kit, and it was sold out.
Yeah.
So secondhand, people were selling them for $500, $600, $700.
That's crazy.
And so that was a a big old nope. That's not gonna happen. I love my Saturn, but not that much. I'll wait.
Well, that's the thing too. It's like as long as you take care of the hardware, it'll last, right? Like take care of it, and then at some point get the add-on when it goes down in price, or emulation will come to a better spot. When it comes to Saturn emulation, it's improved. I thought I used it not too long ago, and it wasn't terrible, but it's definitely got. It's not like Dreamcast emulation, which is funny. Like the Saturn was such a notoriously difficult system to dev for, and it just shows in emulation how it's still difficult. But meanwhile, the Dreamcast, which came out later, is pretty much recreated really well in emulation.
To be fair, Dreamcast ran on a branch of a Windows operating system, so.
Oh, was it like Windows CE or something?
Yes.
Okay. Pulse, what about you? How do you play your retro?
Lately, I've been definitely emulating. I got into using like the retro achievements, but I never got into farming them like a lot of people do. I just can't do it. I kind of burned myself out playing 360 and getting achievements. Then when I went to PS4 and was trying to get trophies, I was just like, no, I can't do this again. So, but the emulators and stuff that they use are great, and I'm not as much of a purist as most, so I just really enjoy it. The ease of not having to blow in carts has kind of spoiled me for that. I'm sure that if I compared one to the other, you'd find differences and probably, see that the hardware is better overall. But I'm too casual a player to really care that much.
So yeah, retro achievements is great fun. I love retro achievements, but you're right. There's a lot of bad achievements. And I have the same issue with Xbox 360 and even Steam achievements, right? For every game that has fun ones, right, challenging ones or interesting ones, there's a dozen games which have Chivos that are like, beat this boss damageless.
Yeah.
Or get to level 3, right, lame ones. And retro achievements is the same thing. For those listening who don't know, if you're one of the few people who don't, retroachievements.org is the website. And it's a group of people who have managed to find a way to put Steam-like achievements in old games. You have to use their emulators, or RetroArch supports it now. And it's a blast with leaderboards and challenges, various badges you can earn. It's a whole community that's sprung up around it. And it's probably one of the cool things about emulation is the Chivo hunting, which a lot of people do.
And I honestly, I like watching other people farm and stuff, but for me, I couldn't be bothered. But that's the same thing with speedrunning. I'll never bother speedrunning, but I'll watch like people speedrun. I like seeing people do things that they're good at. So, and if I'm not good at it, I'll watch someone else do it.
I'm trying to think of like threw me off of Chivos. Probably Tetris. I love Tetris. It's one of my favorite franchise of games. And I was trying to get the set from the Game Boy Tetris, and I got all of them except one. I have to get 200k points on Mode A on Game Boy Tetris, and it should not be this difficult. It shouldn't be, but I hit a wall, and I think I haven't looked back. Otherwise, I think my only badge on Retro Achievements is for Where's Waldo on NES. I think I got that one.
Nice.
Very proud of Where's Waldo.
Was there anything else that involved not having to find Waldo?
Actually, there is, although
There's a
I
few.
had to cheat a bit. My wife had to do it for me. There's a magic carpet section where you have to fly this really janky carpet and collect these things. And I think that was a Chivo, if I'm not wrong.
I don't think that's Where's Waldo. I think that's the Great Waldo Search.
There's more than one?
Yes.
Whoa.
Okay. I did not know that. Well, I guess so. It still had the Find Waldo part to the game.
Yeah, but in Where's Waldo, there is no magic carpet segment, at least on the NES.
And correct me if I'm wrong, after that, didn't you have to go and beat Jafar?
I was about to ask, yeah. Like, is there a genie involved? No, for me, though, I got to say, I really like... I didn't bother... I got into a phase of it when I was probably 18 or so, when it was relatively new, and PlayStation 1, for example, it was near impossible to play a game that was emulated because it wasn't there yet. So that kind of threw me away from it for years. And when I came to Twitch, realized, okay, first off, it's easy. I didn't want to buy a capture card, and I sold most of my collection. Like, I had my Super Nintendo games, but that's the few games that I kept held on to. Didn't want to keep the rest. I kind of did the same thing with my Nintendo. I had a lot of consoles, but not a lot of games. So I didn't really care for it much, and emulation kind of gave me a chance to play the games that I haven't touched in so long. So it's been really cool.
I think for me, the problem with early emulation was the lack of good controllers on PC. It's funny to look at PC gaming today. We're spoiled as PC gamers.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Xbox 360 and Xbox One controller on their own are great controllers. When you compare it to the 90s, when you had, what, is it Logitech? The Gravis
Yeah.
pad, I think?
Logitech and
Oh, the
Gravis,
Gravis
yeah.
gamepad. The Gravis
Yeah.
was like, I liked it because it was the Super Nintendo controller for PC, is what I looked at it as.
Mine had the PlayStation 1 analog. No, not even the analog, the pre-analog PlayStation 1 shape. But it also had like a little screw-in joystick you could put in the D-pad,
Yes.
much like the
That's
Master
terrible.
System had.
So I guess we're not going for a Mad Catz sponsorship.
No, sadly. I just keep chasing that 8-bit dough dream.
Oh yeah,
Please sponsor
Yeah.
us. I love your crap, honestly.
Same.
I think we all have one now. Do we? GP, did
I
we
have
get
two.
you one yet?
I
got two?
will after they sponsor us. I'm hoping.
I got that SNES with the analog, the SNES one that looks like a PlayStation controller with the analog sticks.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, that's the SN30 Plus, I think.
And I got the Saturn one,
The ball.
the M30.
Oh, I call it the Genesis one, but yeah, you're right. It's like the Genesis and Saturn controller. I
Yeah,
love
it's-
that one. That's my favorite.
It's modeled after the Saturn controller's redesign.
Like you had said earlier, how I think when it came to controllers, how playing, say, Super Nintendo games on a Genesis controller doesn't feel right. I had the same problem. I have the same as you, the SN30 Plus with the analog. I actually play Windows games with it. I play Warframe with that thing. That's how much I love that controller.
Nice.
But I also picked up the SN30, which is the non-analog one for Game Boy and Nintendo and stuff.
Yeah, that's what I have.
And I was trying to play Sonic with it, and it didn't feel right. So I ended up getting the M30 because of the big Genesis-style buttons. And I love this controller. The D-pad, I forgot how good the circle D-pad feels. And the M30 is very close.
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be controllers that you could care less. Like the Dreamcast controller is a monstrosity. As much as I love my Dreamcast, the great thing about emulating my Dreamcast is that I don't have to deal with that Frankenstein's monster of a controller. Like, I don't know why the cord comes out of the bottom. I don't know why it's a circle. I don't know why all the buttons and analog sticks are so sparse apart. Like they're really spread out.
It felt like playing
made-
a racing game on Wii with one of those steering like add-ons.
Yeah.
But, it's really just you're playing a dinner plate with buttons.
It's light. Like, without the VMU inside of it, it feels like a cheap, light piece of plastic. I hate that controller. It's one of the worst controllers for me as well.
That was the only system where I ever got a hand cramps besides NES.
And the sad thing is that's the second iteration of the 3D controller that they made for the Saturn.
Right. Because Knights had the other one, right?
Yes. And then what? The Xbox, probably the original Xbox's large controller, the Duke, I think it was often
The
referred
Duke.
to, would probably be the next step logically after that. So like it
The thing with the Duke, though, is I do have big hands, so I appreciated the size for that. But it's still not as good a controller as later generations.
yeah.
I don't know. I think I have normal sized hands, but what I don't have is carpal tunnel. So I had a hard time with the Duke.
That's fair, too. I had to point to all this. Where was I going to go with this?
I don't know. I feel like I kind of killed it. So if whenever this airs, if you could just add in a laugh track. There we are.
I don't think we can afford the rights to the laugh track.
Damn it.
Yeah.
He's still kicking around somewhere.
Yeah, he's still alive, or his like descendants are, or something.
Keep working on that fart track, boys. Okay. Emulation on PC, right? So going back to that. So I had a problem with that because of the controller support on PC was terrible. Direct input back in the day, I think. Later on, when the Xbox 360 came out, Microsoft made a real push to put controllers on PC. And then Steam and Steam machines. And like, I tell you, the last 10 years of PC gaming, I haven't even cared about the lack of consoles, really. I get the Nintendo ones because I love Nintendo stuff, but outside of a few PS4 exclusives, I don't feel like I miss much. So it's been great. But back then, like, plus the emulators were not that good, like Paul mentioned. Not the first emulator, but Nesticle is the one I remember playing the most. And Gene Seist. Yeah, you laugh, and the logo of that Nesticle was a hairy nutsack, if I'm not wrong.
No.
Yeah.
I don't remember the logo of it, but I do remember the emulator.
Should
was,
the nunchuck
cool.
hang lower than the other side? I don't. Is this okay?
No, I remember the Nesticle dude looking like me without glasses, but like if I was a Cyclops. Bald guy with no ears or one eye.
But it was a popular emulator, right? Like anybody with a PC that could run it was using that thing. And it had controller support, as janky as it is. And Gen Zeiss was the same thing. I mean, there were emulators before that, but I think the Nesticle is the most widespread. And it let you play all your Nintendo games. And then, slowly new emulators would come out. But the problem is that software emulation requires a lot. It's very taxing, right? The idea is you're taking your CPU power and you're running some software that mimics and behaves as that console, and it was a lot of power to do so. That's why it took ages for something like the N64 to get a good emulator, right? Because there's a lot behind that system. It's something that's hard to emulate, and it took a while. So emulators, for the longest while, were never the optimal way to play retro games. If you really wanted to play retro, you brought out your old consoles and hoped they still worked. But then you always had the issue of, well, how can I play these things on my TV? Because TV technology has changed over the decades, right? I don't know if you guys remember, but when I had the Atari, that was my first console. And the way you'd hook that up to a TV was with this little black switch and these two,
Oh, the little
prongs
forks.
you would screw to the back of the computer or the TV.
Yeah, I remember those. I had one for the NES, actually,
Yes, so did I.
because I had a TV that was too old for the little coax input. So I had to use those little
Right.
forks and screw them in.
I love the way Jake asked. I don't know if you guys remember when I had an Atari when I was a kid. No, I do not. I'm sorry, I want to.
I mean, you weren't in Toronto in the 80s?
I'm
Really?
sure it was a great time.
Look, I was doing a lot of blow in the 80s. And so I was well traveled when I was 6.
Well, I remember using these prongs on an old black and white TV. That was the TV I had in my room, right? The color TV was in the living room. So the one that I got to use for my games was in my bedroom, and it was black and white. And that's what I used to play Atari games on. I didn't even realize the Atari was color until I was much older. I didn't know. And then I remember playing Legend of Zelda on the freaking Nintendo on a black and white TV. But you're right. So that was the first input. And then coaxial came out. And then the AV cables, right? Those yellow, white, red cables. And that seems to be like the standard for a lot of retro before it kind of moved over to S-Video and then later eventually HDMI. But the problem is the TVs back in the day were CRTs, they were tube TVs, they're analog, right? 60 frames, no problem, no lag, right? Analog components. Whatever signal comes from the Nintendo, the system, is immediately on the screen through the cathode tubes. Cathode tubes. This is where I trip on my words. So it's analog. The problem with modern TVs is, well, let me put it this way. You ever visit family and they're bragging about that big screen TV they got and they throw a movie up and you get sick just looking at the picture? It's too smooth. It has this weird, odd motion blur.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean there.
Oh.
It's unsettling.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like Uncanny Valley. So I'm that jerk of the family who would go to those TV and I would turn off motion smoothing. And then immediately an hour later have the family say, what happened to my TV? Why is it not HD anymore? Because to them, HD is that ugly motion smoothing, right? So I hate the post-processing effects that modern TVs do. And it's a problem from games because smart TVs or modern TVs, they are taking that signal from a console and they're modifying the picture, coloring it, changing it, depixelizing it, upscaling it, all kinds of crazy crap. And the problem is it does, very minorly, but it does introduce lag from the signal to the TV. I'm not hung up on latency when it comes to playing retro games for the most part. But there are... Okay, there's a few. There are a few. And you're right, like Punch-Out, for example, right? You just try to play Punch-Out on a modern TV with a wireless controller on Bluetooth and just not die in seconds. Because that kind of game is not frame perfect, but it damn well feels like it. It was really noticeable for me, and this is what got me rethinking my stance on emulation and how I want to play retro, was most recently on the Nintendo Switch, right? There's a couple things that have come out on Nintendo Switch. They've released basically their virtual console, the Nintendo Online thing. But then also the Mega Man collections got released on Switch. And it's a great collection, don't get me wrong. Like, there's lots of cool stuff in it, and it's all the Mega Man games in there, even the bad ones. But when I try and play Mega Man 2, for example, is it Quick Man stage, I think it is? He's in 2.
Yeah.
This part with the beams that fly across the screen. I swear to God, I cannot beat that level. Not on the Nintendo Switch. Never. It just feels laggy. It doesn't matter how good I do, I cannot pass that level. Whereas if I play now on what I have now is the Mister with a wired controller, it's no problem. I have zero issue with it. Do you guys have any issues with input lag when you're playing any of these games?
I never played anything as demanding as Punch-Out when I was emulating. The worst, I think, difficulty-wise, is probably Super Ghouls and Ghosts. And even then, that's the learning curve I find is the worst about that one.
Well, so the thing with Super Ghouls and Ghosts, that's like the original, right? One hit, pretty much you die. Well, 2 hits, right? Armor, then undies.
Undies?
Isn't it? Ghouls and Ghosts?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I got distracted for a second.
If you get hit, you lose the armor. If you get hit, and then you're naked. If you get hit again, you're dead.
Right. So that's a game, you're right. It's incredibly challenging. And there are some spots where it's very tight with the amount of stuff on screen. But I guess you get used to the input lag. And for most games, I'm like that, where I get used to it, I don't mind it. So, Wolf, is there any games that you find where the lag is really noticeable and you can't play it?
Yeah, but for me, it's never been through proper emulation. It's always been through ports of games. Like you were saying, Mega Man Collection and Mega Man X Collection. The Mega Man Collection 1 on PlayStation 4, not an issue for me. I haven't tried Collection 2, but X Collection and X Collection 2, I just could not. I was getting owned everywhere. And I know it's an emulated port, but I mean, if you're only porting a handful of games, I would feel like you should probably make sure that the input lag is as small as possible.
Right.
Especially with such, a game that requires high reaction times and quick button presses. Call me a stickler.
Well, there's been a bit of a renaissance the last couple of years with the mini consoles, right? I watch, his name is Gmail on Twitch. I love that guy. And he's been doing all the mini consoles. And I laugh because I know that all those minis have input lag, right? They're not the greatest at emulating the games that are on there. I mean, it's convenient because you have 40, 50 games of that console on there. And it comes with very close, redos of the controller and stuff. But there's lag there. And some of those games are like shooters, Punch-Out. It's hard. Like, do any of you guys have the NES Classic or SNES Classic?
I have both, as well as the Genesis and the PlayStation.
Yeah, I've got the NES and Super Nintendo, yeah.
So, GP, start with you first then. How did you find playing those? Do you like playing on those, or do you just find there some issues with it?
It's kind of like the fast forward with the emulated Final Fantasies we were talking about earlier. I didn't really notice the difference until somebody had pointed it out.
Okay.
But then again, I'm kind of, and you guys know this, I'm pretty dumb. And so if somebody doesn't point out stuff like that, I think it's a me issue. Like, oh, maybe I'm still drunk from breakfast, or, any number of things. And it goes back to what you're saying, like, Punch-Out's a good example. For me, the first time I realized something was different, I mean, I was still playing original hardware, but using an upscaler to stream the NES to, Twitch and all that stuff. And I had done a blind run of Battletoads. And then when I moved, I set up my big cathode ray tube TV and hooked the NES up to there and tried playing Battletoads. And the game itself felt like it was psychic. Does that make sense? Like, yes. Or yeah. So then if you go back and play it again, through Twitch, upscaled and all that stuff, it immediately becomes, it feels like the physics equivalent of the ice worlds in Mario 2.
Oh.
Like those are, honest to God, those are the best kind of metaphors I can come up with. If you go back from like a blind playthrough of a game and then play it on a CRT, it is immediate and impressively so. And yeah, so that's what is emulation. First off,
Well, yeah, I had the same problem too, where I kept thinking it's a me issue, right?
right?
I keep saying, am I really bad at Mario 1? I know I've beaten it before, and I know I've beaten it without the Game Genie. I didn't play everything with the damn thing. I've beaten some games before. And yeah, same thing. Adventure Island was another one, although I never beat that as a kid. But I got pretty far into it. But playing it recently, when we did that earlier episode, I was having a real hard time on an emulator with it. And then when I played it on, wired controller, I was playing on the Mister, which I promise I'll talk about in a second. Lag went away. It was a lot, not easier. It's still a hard game, but you're right. It almost feels you're ahead of the game. Like it's more responsive, and it actually does make a difference. So for most games, I don't notice a difference. Like Mario World on the SNES, I don't have an issue with that game at all. But for certain games, especially for me on Nintendo, that input lag is really noticeable when you play it back to back. All right, so I keep saying Mister, and I keep saying emulator. So, and this is, again, going back to the start of the episode where a lot of folks, not a lot, but there's a lot of people on Twitch now who are playing on Misters, and a lot of people don't know what the hell they are.
I am the latter.
Okay, so I'm going to try and explain it. There are smarter people on YouTube who can probably explain this, and I'm going to say two names, Al Anonymous and Smoke Monster, which is a great name. These two guys know the Mister better than I do. So, and honestly, I built mine following Al's videos. So I'll try and explain what the hell the thing is, because it is interesting, and it's interesting technology, and it's not just a Mister. So what these things do is there's software emulation, right? When we say RetroArch, when we say even the NES Classic, right? That's a machine given to you by Nintendo, but it's using a software emulator inside. It's using a CPU, much like the CPU you'd have in a computer or your cell phone. And that CPU is running software to mimic a device, a system. And historically, in the past, emulators had a lot of issues, right? They weren't accurate, they were slower. If I say frame skip, you might remember that as a setting in most emulators back in the day, right? And you had to skip frames because the CPU you were using to run Nesticle or even RetroArch back in the day, or MAME, the CPU wasn't strong enough to keep Nesticle. I know, GP, I know. It wasn't strong enough to run the software emulator, right, fast enough. But now software emulation is kind of advanced because the CPU that you have in your desktop today is insanely powerful and underutilized by Windows, right? RetroArch is either last year or 2018. It's a software emulator, and I have my issues with it, but overall it was great because it has support for many different systems. But they recently added a new feature called Run Ahead mode, which basically uses, because it knows your desktop CPU is amazing, so it's basically running a second copy of itself to basically capture the frames of your system ahead of schedule and serving it up to you. So basically it removes input lag by cheating, by brute forcing what you need to render and giving it to you when you need it. It works fairly well, to the point where a lot of speedrun communities ban it. Because technically, if you crank up a high enough, you can get latency that's negative. That it makes it faster than original hardware, which is interesting. So that's where software emulation is. So when we say emulation, you can reduce lag with things like run ahead mode and a wired controller. It's actually in a really amazing place. Although there are some issues with it. But so I don't want to bash emulation. Emulation is actually in a good spot right now. It's probably the best time to emulate stuff than it has been in decades. But it's not accurate. There's a company called Analog. I thought you guys might have had one. I guess not. The Retron I thought might have been one too. But Analog is known for trying to create clone systems, right? I want to say they started making Nintendo systems with old Nintendo boards. I want to say it's what they started with. And then later they had to find a way to recreate Nintendo hardware. So what they use is something called FPGA chips. Have you heard of them at all? Do you have any idea what they are?
It makes me think of VGA and SVGA, and that's it. And I don't even know what those mean. I just remember those terms.
Is that like $300 or $400, $500 NES? Is that them?
So back when Analog first brought out I think it was the Mini NT, if I'm remembering it right. I think it was expensive.
Yeah.
And it was expensive because they were using old Nintendo boards, right? Refurbished. I think is what it was.
Well, the NT Mini Noir. But actually somebody in GP's Discord mentioned the NT Mini Noir. I guess they're doing another run or something? I don't know. But they're $500 a pop.
Oof.
So the reason they're so expensive is Analog makes very consumer-focused devices, right? They look good, right? They play actual cartridges, and the way they're created with their tech is incredibly accurate to the original hardware. Is it Nintendo? No, but I'll explain why in a minute. It's very accurate to Nintendo, and it plays their cartridges, right down to like the controllers and whatnot too. The other reason they're popular is even though like the NT Mini, and then later there's another one. They have the Mega SG, which is the Sega Genesis clone, and I almost bought that one. People love those because even though they're meant for one system, and they will never advertise that you can use ROMs in these things, right? They always say this is for playing your original your carts. But they have an SD card slot. And like anything with a slot, you can put all kinds of bad stuff in that slot, right? And you can jailbreak those consoles. I was trying to make a bad joke, and I failed.
No, I think it was just right. Thank you.
Okay. But you can jailbreak these devices, right? Again, unofficial. But one of the guys that did that the NT Mini got notable, there's a guy named Kevtris who made a bunch of cores for other systems. So basically he took the hardware that was meant to play Nintendo games, hacked it, so now suddenly you could play Genesis and Sega Master System games on this thing. That's why it became popular for Analog, right? And they've released other clone consoles. They released the NT, the Super NT, which is Super Nintendo. They released Genesis one recently. Even though they're targeted to those family of systems, if you jailbreak it, you can play their stuff on it. That's the idea with these things. And I almost bought one. So why are they accurate? Well, they use something called FPGA chips. Fully programmable gate array, or field programmable gate array, I think is what it stands for. The idea is in your Nintendo right now, GP, if you get a hacksaw and you bust open your Super Nintendo or your Nintendo, go do it. We'll wait.
Okay,
I'm getting the finger.
no, which one's the hacksaw? not to say how bad I am as a handyman.
It's okay. I don't know tools either.
Nice.
Give me a butter knife. That was our screwdriver. But if you open the Nintendo up right now, right, there'll be a handful of chips on a circuit board, right? Everybody knows what a computer circuit board looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Those chips are fixed, right? They have, their gates and logic embedded inside of them, and they're fixed. A factory turns them out, assembling Nintendos, right? They're cheap. They're readily available. That's why they're a thing. But to develop those kind of chips, to test and play around, what corporations or companies used to use was FPGA chips, which are programmable. It's a chip, just like the ones in Nintendo, but the FPGA can be programmed at a hardware level to mimic circuits. That's the difference. And they used to be incredibly expensive. Okay, but, do you guys have Raspberry Pis? I think GP, you have a Pi now, don't you?
No.
I do. I got one earlier this year.
Okay. And so the Pi was revolutionary for a lot of people because it took, classically desktop CPUs are expensive, but then suddenly Pi comes out with a single board computer that can do quite a bit for such a tiny little device. And it's cheap. You can get a Pi for $40. The Pi was great for that thing. And just like that, the FPGA chips, which are programmable and really great tech, are now cheaper than ever. And there's one particular board. It's made by a company called Terrasec. It's called the DE10 Nano. And it's like a student board, right? It's for hacking and tinkering and for students to learn from. It's sponsored by Intel. And it's like $120 US. And I bought one. It's a kit. It comes with a power supply. It has a HDMI slot, Ethernet port. Comes with an SD card, 8 gigs. Has everything you need to kind of mess around. And much like a Pi was revolutionary for, bringing down portable computing with CPUs, the DE10 Nano with its FPGA chip is cheap as it's ever been. And it lets people play around with it. So what people have done with this board, and they've done it, the FPGA chips are on a bunch of different devices. It's not new. It's been around for a while. But what the Mister project has done is it's brought down to a cheaper level where it's actually comparable to what Analog is doing with their systems in terms of price. So the DE10 Nano board, a guy named SicJake started up this project called Mister, and it's open source, right? So anybody can commit changes and develop it. And it was based on an earlier project called Mist. And I didn't know this till today, but Mist was for the Minimig emulator for Amiga and the Atari ST emulator. That's what Mist used to emulate. And then he took Mister because he took the great Minimig emulator and the ST emulator, and he added a bunch of cores to it for things like Nintendo and Atari and all kinds of great systems. And it's all not software emulated. It's not a program, but rather these cores are created that program the FPGA chip to behave like those systems incredibly accurately because it's at a hardware level. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
It does.
Okay. There's so much over my head, honestly, with this stuff.
Like, I couldn't tell you how to do it, but I get what you're telling me.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I'm not going to be making cores anytime soon. I don't know any of this stuff. But it was incredibly easy to take the Mister project. You just download an installer, you put it on an SD card, and you plug it into the Nano, and you've got it working. It's incredibly easy.
Wow.
So the neat thing about the Mister, though, is that people bulk out the price, right? $120. You're like, well, I can get a Pi for 40. Yes. But because these things it's on an FPGA and it's very accurate. When I say accurate, I'm trying to give examples. Well, you guys saw me playing the Game Boy earlier. If you were to play side by side Atari 2600 or Game Boy versus playing on the Mister, something about the quality of the picture and the frame rate is more steady on the Mister. That's my shining example from the Mister. If anybody asks why they should get one, it's Game Boy and Atari 2600. It does many other things, and lots of people love it for other reasons. But for me, it's those two systems that look the best on it. When I try and go back and play Atari 2600 on RetroArch or Stella emulator, something about the quality of the images blurry. It doesn't seem good. But on the Mister, it's crystal clear, and it runs amazingly well. But the Mister is modular. The base board is 120, and it lets you play a couple things like Genesis, TG16, TurboGrafx, even Game Boy Advanced. But you can buy add-ons for it, and that's where it gets tricky. You can buy RAM for this thing. And if you install a RAM module, you can play Nintendo on it. You can play Neo Geo on this now. There's another add-on board that gives you analog output. So for people who love retro consoles, right, but don't want to invest or alter the original hardware to output to, HDMI for streaming, they can always look at the Mister, because the Mister has HDMI, and then with the add-on board has analog out. So I can actually, if I really wanted to, output my Mister to my stream through HDMI, but also to a CRT TV at exactly the same time with no lag. That's where the benefit to the Mister really comes down to, is that outputting the signal. I don't have a CRT anymore. I haven't in years. But just the HDMI signal for me is good enough. But it's the accuracy of the consoles. But also it helps eliminate lag. So I probably talk for an hour on lag, but I'm not going to, because you guys will fall asleep. But when we talk about latency like we were earlier, it comes down to a few things, right? You have controller latency, your display, and then the system. So we were talking a bit earlier about older controllers and whatnot. The thing with controllers on PC is they use USB, right? And USB by default, it gets laggy. It's laggy. So the idea with like a system is your computer has to check with your controller, hey, is a button pressed? Okay, no. Okay, yes. And it's called polling. It's checking with the controller. And it does it, I think the default for USB is 125 times per second. It's like 8 milliseconds or so. But when you look at something like your old Genesis controller, if you look at the old Genesis controller, anybody who loves retro or had one of these machines probably remembers that trapezoid plug. It's direct pins. Each button, each input on your Genesis controller is a different pin. And it goes right to the system. So there's no lag, right? USB is more universal. That's in the name. And it is doing it based on polling. The idea of that the system checks your controller rather than getting the direct feed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the thing with the Mister that makes it great, and there's other ways of doing it too, but the Mister has options to increase the pull rate if the controller supports it. And most controllers from 8BitDo and the big names do. So the Mister can pull the controller, check it 1,000 times per second, like for something along those lines. It's like less than 1 millisecond of checking. So it takes the lag from potentially 8 milliseconds down to less than 1, even though it's the same USB controller you use on a computer. So that's where one way the Mister helps reduce lag. The other is how it connects to your display. It has an upscaler in it, right? I know a lot of people like using something called the RetroTink. I think it's a line doubler, if I'm not wrong. I know somebody would probably chew me out for not knowing this. But there's
Yes,
ways
it
of getting your retro signal upscaled to 720p or 1080p. The Mister can do that with HDMI in a way that is less lag than is other ways of doing it. So the Mister is great for reducing latency, and that's why I ultimately got one. That and Analog's Mega SG, they wanted $70 for shipping. So when I looked at the cost of a shiny, nice-looking analog console and shipping versus it's ugly, but the Mister plays everything, I am getting the Mister, and I don't regret it. I think it's great for that.
Okay. I got the hacksaw. It's cut open. What am I looking for?
So the neat thing is how people make these cores. I found it interesting. You guys have probably all used MAME before, which is a software emulator for various arcade machines.
Yes.
So the Mister has arcade games as well, but they're actual recreations of the original circuit boards used for those arcade games. And there's a couple ways they can make those cores for the Mister and other FPGA systems. One is they just copy the core from another system, which is common. The other is, as a reading process, they actually take the board from an arcade machine and they use a solution to burn off the tops of the chips. They call it decapping. And then I guess with a magnifying glass or a microscope, I don't know, they can read how they're set up, the blueprints, and recreate that in code for something like the Mister. It seems blasphemous to destroy arcade hardware, but they do it in the spirit of these cores are on a system now, can be ported to other FPGA systems in the future. It's a way of preserving arcade games that you don't get quite the same way with software emulation.
It's pretty interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Like, it's
But-
still over my head, but at the same time, I'm starting to understand the concept you're getting on with. So
Yeah.
I like that.
I had one question when you first started explaining this whole Mister technology to me, and then I had a second question because of a video I watched recently. So the first one is, how likely is it that if the power were put toward it, that this would be able to emulate a Saturn better than software emulation?
So, this is a good question, actually, because everybody wonders, like, if I get a Mister, it's constantly being updated with new stuff, right? The Neo Geo core was added not too long ago, for example, and that's a pretty beefy machine. But now people are asking, well, what about PlayStation or N64 or, Saturn? Can the Mister's chip do it? The idea with an FPGA chip, it's so hard to say, is much like a CPU is, I guess, measured in what do you call it, hertz?
Mhm.
Yes, gigahertz. FPGA is measured in logic gates. How many gates are inside the chip that can be programmed, right? Because an FPGA chip can be programmed to behave as multiple chips, right? The classic Nintendo, for example, only has a handful, whereas something like the Saturn has a few. And they're more complex. They're more complicated, right? So it takes more logic gates to mimic a Saturn. It takes many more to emulate an N64. The chip that's inside the DE10 Nano, which is what the Mister is based on, probably won't be able to do Saturn. It's too complicated. I was reading a few articles, and a lot of people are saying that looking at it, it could probably do PlayStation 1, but something about the N64 and the Saturn are too complex to recreate on the Mister's chip. But the same technology, FPGA chips, as the price comes down, more of them come out in the future that have more gates, have the ability to expand it to emulate more complicated systems. But the Mister itself only works in this one board. So, 2-3 years from now, it'll probably be a different open source project that uses a different, better FPGA chip, right? But not to say the work on the Mister is not useful, because once you've gotten those digital blueprints working on a lesser FPGA, slapping that core on an FPGA with more gates there's no difference, right? And it makes
Yeah.
it very portable. So yeah, it's one of those things where I think a Saturn recreated on FPGA is a ways off, but something like the Terra Onion, which uses an FPGA chip to mimic the CD drive of a Saturn, is interesting as hell. And it's only, a newer chip away before it becomes a reality.
So, leading to my second question then, and this is a question that I got from a YouTube channel I discovered not too long ago. He doesn't have a whole lot of subscribers. It's really interesting if you're into this sort of stuff and like the programming and hardware capabilities behind gaming. The channel is Displaced Gamers. He brought up a question of accurate emulation and reproduction of the video game audio from all these old games. Because a lot of times it's never perfect. It's always, well, it's good enough. And
right.
as time goes on, and it's not just gamers that do this, it's kind of everybody. We all just kind of look at our audio systems as like, well, good enough, We've got sound bars. We don't have, multiple component hi-fi systems anymore. So
Guilty.
We play music on our phones or our little earbuds, and we store our music on our iPods instead of listening to it through records most of the time. And I'm not saying this is everybody, but the majority of consumers, ease over accuracy is really what it is. And what's the potential of these FPGA chips to accurately reproduce the sound quality?
Well, you're definitely right that people sacrifice audio, for sure. I mean, MP3 is based on the idea of taking sound or music in the smallest file size possible, but it reduces quality, right? You're absolutely right. So the FPGA, though, just like you can recreate the graphics chip, you can do the same thing with the sound chip. The one I'm looking forward to the most is there's a guy who's working on a, is it CSP2 or CPS2?
CPS2, Capcom.
Right, that's Capcom's fighting chip, the second one, and that's the one where you had Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Street Fighter Alpha and the Dungeons and Dragons games.
Yeah, there was a lot of games on that CPS2 board.
Yeah, and once a guy figures it out, it'll be awesome because those are all the games I love from the arcade. But one of the biggest things is the sound. That Q sound, I think is what they called it. And it sounds amazing. So yeah, absolutely. You recreate it just like you recreate the graphics chip, you recreate the sound as well. And the neat thing too, if not wrong, there's a lot of the older systems that used to use the same type of chip for their sound processing from system to system. That's why I think Genesis sounds very similar to other old retro computers. It's using the same type of chip. And theoretically, if you can recreate one chip, you can recreate any of the chips back then. So it's very accurate. So I mean, I don't have an ear for this stuff, but from the way I understand it, as accurate it is for the graphics, it's accurate for the sound. Somebody was asking me before about the Famicom disk system, because that has technically better sound than the Famicom, right? I think it's Castlevania has better music, for example, and the Mister does recreate that.
Yeah, there's something like 2 or 3 additional sound channels, I believe, on the FPS.
And then that's all on the Mister. The Sega Mister system, which some games have FM support, and the Mister has both of those sound chips, the FM and the non-FM sounds if you want it. So it does recreate that, which is great. So I mean, it's great. I love the thing, but it's expensive, right? Like the baseboard is $120, which is already expensive. But if you want to play Neo Geo and Nintendo, then you need to buy the RAM module. That's $50. And then if you want to output to a CRT and then have a fan for cooling, that's $50. And then if you want to plug in a bunch of Bluetooth adapters and Wi-Fi and controllers, well, then you're probably going to want the USB hub, and that's $50. So I mean, if you go all said and done on the Mister, you could easily drop $300 on the thing. So it's not without its cost for sure.
This is kind of exciting to hear about. Like, you've been talking about the Mister for a while, and I've always been like, oh, it sounds neat, but I don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
And so now I kind of get it. And so I'm actually more excited about this. And let me just put this disclaimer here. I'm sure there's some of you out there that are like, no emulation ever. And you know what? If that's how you are, cool beans, nothing against it. But there are a lot of people who don't have access to these older games, either because these games aren't or weren't available in the market that these people are in. They're too expensive to get their hands on now, And in some cases, they don't have the space. I've actually been somewhat reducing my game collection because we moved out of a 3-bedroom home into a 2-bedroom apartment a year and a half ago. So we just don't have the space anymore.
Yeah, games take space. They're huge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you guys have seen my game shelf before the move. It was massive. And that wasn't even all of it. I had more shelves that were not behind me on camera on my stream. But there's something to be said for being able to access all these old games without having to have your hands on the original hardware, the original software, and all that. Because sometimes it's not feasible. In that regard, I feel like emulation creates a doorway for people to access these old games, be it people who've never played them or people who can't afford to get their hands on them. Like my son, I put a bunch of games on my NES Classic not too long ago, and he's been having a blast with it. Whenever I have my NES hooked up, he doesn't touch it. So,
Yeah.
Well, it's something they've said about having an entire library of games versus just, the carts you have on hand.
exactly. And I mean, honestly, I've got 40 or 50 NES games, which is nothing compared to GP's collection. But still, I don't expect my kid to go digging through the drawers trying to find which NES game he wants to play, plug it in, get it to work, and play it. Like in this, he can look through, find the game he wants to play it. He's already in,
Yeah.
So there are definitely downsides to emulating, but there's also enough upsides to where I don't feel like anybody should be, picked on, I guess, for emulating rather than using original hardware.
Yes. Like I was very close to picking up an old Atari 2600. It was my first console. Nostalgia hit me pretty hard, and I kind of wanted one. But then I realized to get that to work on a modern TV, it's a lot of work, and I have to mod the console. I'm not a tech guy. I'm like GP. I don't know what a hacksaw is, okay, to be honest. The last time I tried soldering something, I burnt my fingers, right? So I get burns. So I don't want to mess with that stuff. And it's a lot of work. And the thought of getting like an original Master System or Nintendo, having to mod it or buy it pre-modded and pay a premium for it, it didn't make sense to me, right? But if you're somebody who already has all those consoles and all those games already, then the Mister is not even worth it for you. Why would you? You already have everything, and it's great. But for a lot of people entering the retro hobby, it can be very intimidating, I think, to go out and find all that stuff in the hardware and set it up.
That's the thing. It's not cheap, especially when you're going into a game that's popular. The cost is just going to get astronomical, and it's going to add up really quick. If you're going to play a game here or there, then it's not so big a deal. But it's going to come down to preference, and there's benefits on either side of it. And I don't think that either one is more right or wrong than the other, to be honest. So whatever gets you playing that game, that's what's important to me. I want to be able to relate with other people about games that I've played. That's half of the fun of it.
And it also opens up things too, where games I never even played as a kid and I've heard about, something like the Amiga, right? The Amiga is like the big thing from Europe. It feels like everybody who grew up in the 80s in Europe had an Amiga. Much like the Commodore 64 in North America, it was Amiga over there, and I've never touched it. So the Mister has a core for the Amiga, and I have a whole library of games I've never played before, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
The Amiga is one of the best sounding sound library I've ever heard. It's like, I love Genesis sound. Amiga's way better. It's just interesting as hell, and there's all kinds of games on it. Some are bad.
Oh yeah, my
like
uncle,
Ninja Turtles.
my uncle was super into the Amiga growing up. Like, there was Nintendo Power, and then for some people, there was the lesser known Sega Visions, for those of you who are Sega fans. But there was even an Amiga magazine. My uncle got the Amiga magazines.
Oh, wow.
And so I was the only nephew that he had that was like super into games as much as he was. So, I'd come over and he'd show me all his new stuff he got. He was so excited to share this stuff with me. And so when Chuck Rock first came out, he was showing me Chuck Rock. When Another World, or what's the other name of it? I know it is Another World. Out of This World.
This World.
Yeah, when that came out, he was showing me that. these older games that were on everything but also on Amiga often played or looked better on Amiga than they did on Genesis or Super Nintendo or whatever was the prevalent console at the time. And he was just so into it, and I'd see it and I'd be like, man, that looks great. And then I'd play it on the other one and I'd be like, well, this is pretty close to what he was playing, and I don't have an Amiga, so I'll play it here.
And like to play that now, I don't even know if it's even possible to get an original Amiga and a display that still works and a hard drive that's not busted and play Amiga games. I just don't think that's a thing now.
I'm kind of sad because I think he had all that when he passed away, and I would have loved to have that kind of stuff, but unfortunately, I think his girlfriend probably ended up dumping a lot of that. I tried to get a hold of some of his stuff. Like, he had comics and everything that I wanted, and didn't get any of it, unfortunately, but I'm sure he still had that when he passed away.
That's the other thing, too, is I had a lot of these games, too, as a kid, and I sadly got rid of them. Like, GP, I got to ask, because you have a sizable Nintendo library right now. How much of that is recent, and how much of that is from when you were a kid?
Well, oh, God. There's a couple different ways to answer that. So, from when I was a kid, maybe 40. That's a big maybe. Like, really, probably closer to, like, upper teens. But when I started the retro therapy, we were at 63 or 64 NES carts. So in the 2 years since we've been doing the channel with the quest for NES, just from my wife and I, game hunting, and people sending in donation carts, we're at about 280. And so, yeah, we've quadrupled and then some our collection over the past 2 years just from, hunting and generosity.
Wowza.
It's crazy to see so many Nintendo games just on a shelf.
Well, and you guys,
It's just
you guys were talking about like how much room they take up. They're heavy as shit too. Like, we just moved, and the number of Rubbermaid totes that I had to carry and schlep around, and like I've got them, displayed in my background on a wooden like quality entertainment system or center, and the wood is starting to bow. Not exaggerating.
Wow.
It's intense. So I'm gonna have to go back to like a metal frame. But yeah, they're sizable and hefty.
Yeah, the collecting aspect is just, as much as I'd love to, I can't do the space. I give my wife shit for her Beanie Baby collection because it's like 8 tubs of the damn things. But I'm like, I'd be just as bad with Nintendo as I could. Like, Paulsh, I think you're like me. I think we both gave up our collections, and we maybe regret a little bit of it.
Yeah, it's like 90% I'm okay with, and then 10% every now and then I'm like, I wish I still had that. But it's most of the systems I don't regret selling. Nintendo and my PS4 are the two main ones. But lately PS2 is coming back to me, so I'm kind of wanting a PS2 now.
Yeah, for me, it's always going to come down to just like the preservation, the ability to play these games is important. I mean, I may not want to, but like I just think of, I hope I try to get my kids to play the old games, and they do love a lot of the Mario games and whatnot. But 20 years from now, I hope that they're interested in looking back at the old games. Like, I know I am. Like, again, the Misters opened me up to a bunch of systems I didn't know existed or I didn't know anything about. The one I kind of want to buy it. It's called a Vectrix. It's instead of a CRT, it's actually it's a vector display. It's a vector machine, and it's all-in-one unit. It's like a tiny little monitor. I want to say it's like a 9-inch monitor, and the controllers are on this old like phone cord. Like it's from the 82, 83, I think. I think it was made by GE. And it's an old ass video game machine, but it's vector graphics. It's not pixels. It looks dope as shit, honestly. It's amazing. The games are fun. And the games look, to me, a lot better than some of the Atari and Coleco ports that came out later on. So I think it's really cool. And I only found it because of the Mister, and I went back and played it. Or like, there's one system computer called the PDP-1 from 1960, right? This is one of those huge-ass computers you'd have at university, right?
Punch cards.
Used a circular radar-style monitor, right? And, of course, an expensive computer at a university, they want to play games on it. So one of the, probably, I think it's considered the first video game. It's called Space Wars. And it's not very complicated, but it has, gravity and 2 little spaceships, and you're shooting each other around a star. And it's it's cool as hell, and from 1960. And unless you go to a museum where one of those things is actually working, the only way you're going to play this game on that system is on something like the Mister, recreated for the emulation. And I think that's just really cool that old games can still be played. It can still be, part of history to read about, sure, but actually played is a whole other thing.
Yeah. And there's actually a book that I was reading called, was it Retro Game or Vintage Games 2.0? And they were basically talking about the formative experience. Because for me, video games started with Nintendo. It started before that. And these are titles that, besides Pong and like Pitfall, games that were before Nintendo that I never really heard of. And then they get into the big ones like Pac-Man and such. But they also list a way for you to play it as closely, as accurately as possible to the original. And I thought that was really cool that they actually make a point to try to emulate it as much as possible, not try to improve it, not try to do it, not just port it and hope that it works, but as true a recreation as you can play it. And I thought that was really cool that you take those lists of games and say, here, do this and become it. But just try it. I just think it's pretty neat.
Well, I love it. As much as I use save states too. I love retro achievements. I use fast forward. All those emulation features that got added in the last, decade or so are great. But there's something to be said about going back to playing the games how they originally were is great. And it's great holding that old brick Nintendo controller in your hand and playing on a CRT, but that's just not realistic for most of the people. So, and to be able to play that in other ways and still have a fairly accurate way of doing so is great. So emulation's great for that.
Yeah, my wife made me give up my CRT years ago.
See, I still have one in the closet. It's a 40-inch Sony one, but it's got the white bands of death at the top. So we stopped using it. I don't know if there's a way to fix that.
I'm not sure.
Because I'm in the process of moving, and I was thinking about just tossing it at the curb. But if I could fix it, I might actually use it.
Probably parts replacement.
Yeah. I don't know. Anybody else have any final thoughts on emulation or old games or?
No, I'm drawing blank now. All I know is that all this emulation talks made me want to go back and play some of these games that, like you said, with your kids in 20 years from now, you're hoping they'll want to go back and play. I want to try some of the more formative ones because Super Nintendo is my favorite, but that wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the ones before that, and they were constantly pushing boundaries of the hardware and stuff. And that's what they're doing now with all the beautiful graphics and stuff for like modern games. They're still doing the same thing, pushing whatever they can. And I kind of want to go back to the basics a bit and just see where it all started because it makes me appreciate it all a lot, even more.
All right. GP, Wolf, any last thoughts?
I think we covered everything I had on my mind.
Yeah, I found this to be very enlightening, and I've had fun listening and participating in the amounts that I have.
Enlightening. I felt it was like really fattening, and it was delicious and rich.
It was beefy.
Beefy.
I feel like this is one of the more educational episodes we've done in a while. But
I thought you were about to
I was
say
into
edgy, like we've isolated an entire branch of people somehow. But yeah, it's very educational.
Damn you, Adventure Island fans. I know you're better than me. Wait, you are.
Yeah, man, input lag was a thing, but I still suck at Nintendo games. Ninja Gaiden has taught me that damn well this past 2 weeks. All right, well, we'll finish up. Pulse, where can folks talk to you and find you?
You can find me in the Press B to Cancel Discord if you'd like to talk to me. We have the link there on our website, and I'm sure we can post it on Twitter and such. But yeah, you can find me there, and yeah, look forward to it. I want to hear what you think about emulation.
Awesome. Wolf, how about you? Where can folks find you?
Here, Twitter, and hopefully by the time this airs on Twitch. If not, then hopefully soon after.
All right, great. And GP, where can folks find you?
When people listen to this, will this be considered emulating?
Is this a virtual GP?
We're emulating radio shows. We're making our own.
Then I am pro emulation.
Oh my gosh. I heard my kid was watching a cartoon not long ago where they were talking about listening to the radio and they called it old-timey podcasting.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Tommy podcasting.
But yes.
Artisanal podcasting.
Artisanal podcasting. Well, if it's not from the podcast region of France, it's actually just called sparkling radio.
Oh god.
It's a little highbrow humor. Okay. No, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/theretrotherapy, or you can find me, where else? Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, also as The Retro Therapy. And then, of course, pressbtocancel.com.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next week.
Love you.
I
like you too.
I need to learn how to do this voice.
It's almost like breathing in.
Oh, there's my issue. Is the breathing.
Special thanks for music go to Arthur the Ancient, found on SoundCloud, or The Last Ancient on YouTube. For more episodes, please visit our website, pressbtocancel.com. As well, feel free to like or subscribe at Apple iTunes, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else you'd like to listen to your favorite shows. As always, thank you. This has been
Press B to cancel.
That's good.